Slog FPV. I've been flying the Happymodel Sailfly-X for a month now. Happymodel has a knack for gathering up quad components, throwing them into a bag and shaking them up and coming out with a surprisingly good quad that is a great performance value. Like the very successful Mobula 7, Happymodel has done it again with the Sailfly, in my opinion. Is it the best toothpick out there? No, but as far as value, I bought mine for $82 with a coupon, and the list being $88. It is definitely a performance value based off of how well it flies. It has quickly become one of my favorite park flyers, even more so than my Mobula 7 or Eachine trash can that I have. I still fly these and prefer these in the backyard, but for more open outdoor park flying, where you don't want to draw attention with a 2-inch or 3-inch noisy quad, the Sailfly hits the mark with some caveats, and I'll go over the pros and cons at the end of the video. The highlights are, it weighs 35 grams. I was measuring approximately 38 grams, and I'll show you the measurements right here. And 60 grams with a 3S 300 mAh battery. So the wheelbase is 105 millimeters. On 3S, the performance is definitely mind-blowing for such a tiny quad. It uses the all-in-one Crazy Bee F4 Pro V2. It's basically the same flight controller that's in the trash can, only it's a version 2. It's more suited for 2S flying and 3S. It does come with the XT30 connector with this capacitor that helps with video noise reduction, and it also reduces the inrush current when you plug in the battery. So the 4-in-1 ESC handles 5 amps continuous with 6 amp burst. The camera is really the same thing as what's on the Mobula 7. The resolution is 700 TVL. The field of view is 120 degrees. It supports NTSC. It's only 25 milliwatt output, and it does support for 40 channels. It's smart audio capable. The motors are 1102 8500 kV. These are the production model. They have the 1.5 millimeter shaft. I know there were some prototypes that originally were at 1 millimeter, but then they went ahead and went with the 1.5 millimeter shaft. So those are the highlights. So next, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and go over some setup tips. This is not a complete from scratch setup tutorial, but rather a quick overview with some tips. I will link to a full tutorial on setting up a quad from scratch that Joshua Bardwell did. You know, he does a lot better job than I could ever do. So I'm going to go ahead and link that below. So this is just my changes to the default settings. So before I get started, I would like to recognize KababFPV for coming up with this the toothpick genre of quads. I will link his channel below, and you can just search on toothpick, and he has a lot of videos on you know, how he built up different toothpicks and different motors and different flight controllers that he's done. I know he is working with the quad manufacturers to come out with a Kabab toothpick, bind and fly, and I look forward to reviewing it when it does come out. So before I get into the Betaflight configurator, just wanted to give you a couple of tips. One, I would recommend wrapping the wires. I'm using some wire harness thin tape here, fabric. I'll link below where you can get that off of Amazon. And then the other thing I would recommend is tie wrapping the XT30 connector. I have had the battery eject. There's no battery pad here, so yeah, the TPU holder does hold it in with friction, but in a crash it definitely will eject that, and so you could end up pulling off your XT30 connector if you don't tie wrap it. So I definitely just use a thin tie wrap for that. So let's go ahead and get into the changes that I did in Betaflight. So I would recommend upgrading to a newer version of Betaflight. The version that I had was an early beta version of Betaflight 4.0. It isn't really compatible with the latest Betaflight configurator. So before you do that, you definitely want to do a diff and capture the current settings. So diff space dash all, capture the settings, and just go ahead and save that to a file and change it to the name that you want it to be. I've already saved it off. And then go ahead and do your firmware upgrade. So at the time of this video, I had upgraded to the 4.03. You can check to see what the latest version is when you go ahead and upgrade. I do recommend doing a full chip erase and then just go ahead and load the firmware and flash it. So one of the critical items, because they flipped the flight controller upside down and turned it, there's two critical items here. One is the roll degrees is 180 degrees, and the first gyro is counterclockwise 90 degrees. And you can see that if you dump the CLI. You can go ahead and paste back in your diff file. But if you look here, there's two things that happened here. One is they had to remap the motors, and actually the documentation that came with the Sailfly-X shows that, but this is a critical piece. Because it's upside down, they had to remap the motors. So these are the CLI commands that are super critical, otherwise it's not going to fly. And then the rotation of the sensor and the flight controller and the other tab. But if you look at it, let me scroll down here to where right here, set align board roll 180 degrees. That's where they did the orientation along with the motor remapping. So those two things are critical. But if you cut and paste your old diff file, that automatically will set those to the correct orientation. So other things I changed, the motor idle throttle value was set at 5 when I received mine. I lowered that down. This is a very light model. The other thing I did, change the arming angle to 180 degrees. The gyro update frequency and PID loop frequency, I think they were like 8K, 2K, can't exactly remember, but I changed these to 8K. And the other thing I did was I changed the SPI bus receiver provider to FRSky_D, so I can bind in D8. If you leave it on X, you won't be able to bind it in D8 mode, which everybody's recommending. If you don't, it does have tendencies to lock up and look like a fail-safe, and if you bind it in D8 mode, it doesn't have that issue. So definitely recommend that. And then also, strangely, they didn't have anti-gravity and dynamic filtering turned on, so I enabled those two. They didn't have the RX lost and RX set turned on, so I turned those on because I want to use D-shot beacon to find the model. Then the only other thing I changed on this tab is turned off USB. So I didn't change anything in the power battery management. Go to PID tuning. What I did, I actually, Albert Kim did a good tune. So I went ahead and just copied his PIDs. I'll go ahead and link his video. The PIDs that he had, I figured I'd just use them and try them out to start with and modify them from there. And I didn't have to modify them at all. He does have a throttle limit of 75% set. I flew it with and without it being at 75%. I also set it at 100%, and it flew fine. On both 3S and 2S. The only things I changed from his are more of a preference. Of course, my rates are changed to my rates. And then the feed forward transition, I set this to 0.3. That's just the way I normally run things. I did turn off iTerm rotation. I do fly occasionally line of sight, but I turn that off. and because I didn't think it needed to be on, and everything I term relax was set correctly to gyro because I do more acro flying. So that actually is about all I did. If you go to the receiver tab, I did pick FR Sky, which is AETR1234. I think it comes with this different mapping than what I normally have, so I just selected FR Sky, and this is what I usually have all my my channel maps set up for all my models. And as far as modes, this is again a personal preference. These are my modes. I have an arm switch and an angle flight mode switch, 3-position switch. I have a beeper on aux3. I don't have air mode on all the time. It comes on with the flight mode switch, which is on aux1 for me, and flip over on crash is on aux3, and again, most people have this on aux1. I have it on aux2. It's just a personal preference. I'll go ahead and give you a dump of my CLI, and you guys can use it if you'd like. The only other thing I do is I do have a rate switch and 3 different rate profiles. So that's the only other thing I do that's a little different than what was be considered more of a stock like settings. So here are my final thoughts on the Sailfly-X. The pros: it flies great on 2S or 3S with Albert's tune. The freestyle capability I think is even better than the Mobula 7, which is giving it high praise, because the Mobula 7 I think is a great little acro flyer. The flight times are 5 minutes plus on 2S. I think again Happymodel's hit a home run again with this model as far as value. It's a great little park flyer due to its small, lightweight, and it is really quiet. So in that respect, it doesn't draw a lot of attention with those bi-blade props. The cons: I don't think this is a quad for a beginner pilot. Something like a Tiny Hawk is much better for that. This quad, in my humble opinion, is way too fast for a beginner and requires knowledge of Betaflight when you upgrade it. For example, the motor mapping, people might miss that step when they upgrade, and that could be a concern. Also, the frame is fragile. So I have crashed it in parks and stuff on grass, and it's held up quite well, but I could see if you hit the pavement, you're probably going to crack this frame. But that comes with being lightweight. The receiver range is limited, and it is an issue because this thing flies very fast. I think somebody measured the speed. I think it was Grayson Hobby at like 59 miles an hour very consistently. So it can get out of range pretty quickly with the receiver that this thing came with. So you need to watch the RSSI values. I mean, you could always add in an XM Plus to get additional range. It'd add a little weight, but that's probably worthwhile in doing. And then the other con is there's no camera adjustment as far as the angle of the camera. You would have to swap out the canopy if you want a lower angle. So I will link Thingiverse to a lower angle canopy. I didn't print it out, but there's one out there if you want to go with a flatter angle so you can fly it a little slower. So in conclusion, I don't think you can go wrong with this purchase. If you're an intermediate to advanced pilot, I think it's definitely worthwhile. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and show you some flight footage, just so you can see the flight characteristics of it. Personally, I think it flies, I enjoy it most on 2S, 3S. When I changed the throttle limit, took it off and made it 100%, it's just kind of too fast. I mean, I can fly it fine, but it's so fast it gets out of range so quickly. And I think 2S, you can do all the acrobatic flying that you want, and you get longer flight times on 2S as well. So I think my preference is really to fly it on 2S, because for me that's plenty of enough power. So with that, thanks for watching.